Good afternoon, and thank you again for your attendance today. And I know many of you have been here all day and have heard the amazing lectures that we've been privileged to hear from our distinguished visitors. Today, now, we have a panel that includes all of today's speakers, as well as our evening dinner speaker, two-time Pulitzer Prize-winning author and historian Alan Taylor. Please help me welcome all of our speakers: Elliot West, Patty Limerick, Tim Egan, Peter Castor, Richard White, and Alan Taylor. What an amazing lineup. Now, the panel session is titled "The Frontier, the American Dream, and the Role of Public Higher Education in the Future." But really, we can talk about anything we want to, and I hope we will. It's a chance for us to reflect on today's conversations, for you all to interact with each other. I'm team teaching a course this semester with two of my friends and colleagues, and we all see the world differently, and it's been tremendous fun to discuss with each other, civilly but often in total disagreement about the nature of reality. And so I hope that you feel willing to respectfully challenge and question each other. It'll certainly make it more interesting if we have a lively conversation in which we're allowed to disagree with one another. And so after a few questions that I'll sort of throw out to an initial speaker, but then hope very much that you'll spontaneously pick up the threads of conversation amongst each other, we'll hopefully have time for some question and answer from the audience. So please be thinking about what questions you might have. And so let me start by being faithful to the topic of the panel, and I'll cast this one towards Professor White initially, who talked about the role of the government in the making of the West. And let me ask you specifically about the nature of education in American expansion. President Boren wrote an op-ed in defense of public higher education about a year ago and said that the idea of public higher education is as American as the frontier. And behind that, he means that from the Northwest Ordinance to the Morrill Act, from the foundation of great public university system in California, and as Peter talked about, the foundation of really the greatest public higher education system in the world, in the state of Oklahoma, the territory of Oklahoma. There's some essential connection between the frontier expansion and the role of public education, common and higher education. So I'd start with Richard. How does that fit into your story? And then hope that the others will chime in after you've reflected on that question.
In terms of higher education, particularly in the West, but it also moves back east, it's a Civil War story. I mean, the Morrill Land Act is a Civil War act which through land grants, sets in place agricultural education. And many of the public universities, I mean, it's the usual thing you all know. If it's Oklahoma University, that means it's the state university, usually the flagship, but Oklahoma State would be the land-grant university, which is set up to be...
Is there law enforcement here? We've got some rowdy...
And the funding of these is really one of the great triumphs of the United States in the late 19th and early 20th century. And here, I'm clearly going to speak as a partisan for this because the hardest thing I ever did in my professional career was to take a job at Stanford University. I'm a product of public schools. I'm a product of public universities. I taught at Michigan State, I taught at Utah, I taught at Washington. And if anybody had told me that I was going to end up teaching at Stanford University, I would have hung my head in shame. But here I am. And the reason I went is at a certain point, I realized public universities were ceasing to be public in the way that I knew them. They were ceasing to be public because they weren't funded by the public. They were not accessible to large numbers of the public. And they weren't making the same kind of contact with the public that they used to do, that they had become institutions which had been much more narrowly defined and which, because of their financing, had to do many of the things that privates did. As you all know, I don't know about Oklahoma, California is right now in the middle of a crisis of curbing enrollments because UCLA and Berkeley are both, for all practical purposes, privates on public land, and they're capping their enrollment of in-state students. I tell my students, and this is true, I went to the University of California system virtually for free. I paid $90. California's heyday, you went to public schools when you went into kindergarten and you could graduate from the best universities in the world, and the whole thing was free. It almost seems a dream now. And I think it served California very well. So the heyday of public universities, I would say, was when I was going to college. Actually, all of us think the heyday of anything is when we're going to college. But there is a crisis in it right now, and I'm not willing to give up on the publics, but often when I'm forced to talk about this, I really do feel like I've just jumped ship and am running away in the life raft, and all its women and children are going down with the ship back there. But I'm not sure what good I could have done staying in the publics.
Is it on? Oh. First of all, the University of Arkansas is both the flagship university and the land-grant university, so we're one up on everybody. Richard and I were at a conference in Nebraska a couple of years ago, and it was on 1862, the 1960, or what was it, 2012 and 1862. And it was interesting because so much happened in that year, 1862, regarding the West, the Transcontinental Bill, Homestead. And it was interesting that the Morrill Act was the one that came out the best in the discussion. You know, by the end of the day, everybody agreed that it was largely a success, and I think I would have to certainly agree with that. I've also done work earlier in social history, the history of the family in the West, and I can tell you that in the history of the family, that the desire for public education goes well below higher education. One of the things that struck me was the people who moved out to a place like Oklahoma or out to the Rocky Mountains, the extraordinary efforts that families went to establish some sort of a public schools. They saw that as the future, and they saw this as a serious commitment that every civilized culture must make. So it's one way in which I think the very best of a culture was transmitted to the West. Following up a little bit on what Richard said, I agree absolutely in terms of this kind of crisis that higher education, public higher education is in now. But at least where I teach, it's still such a rewarding experience because while there are standards to get into it, you still get a genuine cross-section of the society that the institution serves. I was thinking, as you were saying that a couple of weeks ago, I had a student who's there every class come up to me and said, "I'm going to have to miss next class." I said, "Okay." He says, "I've got to go. My dad's getting out of prison. I've got to go. Got to go pick him up." And probably the best single student I've ever had was the son of some pig farmers in Springdale, Arkansas, just north of Fayetteville, who went on to be a Marshall Fellow, finalist for a Rhodes Scholarship, and got his first job out of the chute as a chaired endowed professor at Georgetown University. And he came from just north of Fayetteville, from a family who had never been to college before that. So in that sense, it's still working. In that sense, it's still very rewarding for me, at least, to be part of a public school.
Let me jump in on this, if I could. I think it's on. Yes. Okay. My trajectory is the opposite of Richard's. I am a product of private school, college and university, and I've moved into public universities over time. And I'm at least public universities in name. The University of Virginia doesn't receive much in the way of public funding anymore. And so I certainly understand the point that public higher education is in a much tougher spot than it used to be. But I think that it's worth the effort to continue to sustain it. I'm a bit more optimistic that in another generation at least, that as long as we have public universities, that there's the possibility for the public to make a renewed investment in them.
I had to write an essay on the history of higher education in the West, and that was a good experience for me because I was really struck by how impoverished and pathetic the resources were when all of the private schools as well as public ones, and it just cut off a whining cycle for me. If you think, oh, we don't have enough funding, you think, oh my Lord, when you read the stories of these schools with so little money and presidents out just in desperation trying to keep the doors open the second semester. And so it was really moving to me, and I have really had to stop complaining, which is a shame because professors like that, and it's a pleasant experience. But I also was struck by the range of subjects, the astounding range of subjects that a professor in the 1870s would be teaching, of just the catalog of disciplines that one professor was, and then our pathetic state of such narrow specialization, and not this crew, for heaven's sake, but other. It just was a, why on earth did we get this notion that we could only teach in these tiny subject matters? And the adventure, the kind of team teaching things that I think are starting up now are very exhilarating to get back in that broader world. I also have decided that I have no problem with somebody evoking the not so accurate version of Western history on behalf of the good cause of education. So when we do have, I hate to tell you this, but we have the best mascot. We have that buffalo, Ralphie. And when Ralphie runs around the field, it is obviously evoking a lot of old stereotype notions of the adventurous West, and it is glorious, and it warms people's hearts, and they are supportive of the university, and so I am fine with that. Richard and I went to the University of California, Santa Cruz, and that was started in 1965. Well, thank you. And it was not known for its embrace of imperial expansion and conquest and invasion. I was back there for a reunion a month ago. The people who were in the founding class refer to themselves as pioneers. And I thought, this is a time for a Western historian to be quiet, because they don't want to think about the displacement of native people, the stuff that Elliot covered. If I come to a reunion and speak about how their word pioneer is loaded with the introduction of disease and misery to other people, which probably was part of the Santa Cruz experience, I guess, in those, you were there in the earlier years. So, but I did not say a word. You're hearing this for the first time, because I thought, these people love their university, and that's a wonderful thing to see. And if they've used a colonial imperial metaphor for it, okay, there are worse forms of expressing love. I'm not quite sure what they are, but it's fun. It's good. So I wanted to say that, and then I wanted to say that I want to be at a public university, although I saw enough of this in private universities. But I want to speak of Tracy, who is a student who is a anthropology English double major, and she has worked her way through school, every piece and part of that, and she came upon our certificate in Western American Studies, and she wanted to do that. And to do that, her senior last semester, she had to take 21 credit hours, and Tracy, coming in to tell me about her decision, said, well, that's not the easiest thing to do, because I work 30 hours a week in retail. Oh, my Lord. I mean, to aspire to be this young woman's equal. So I appreciate that very much. But then I want to say that I think this is all about a big dilemma that we're not doing so well at, which is generational change and generational relationship in the United States. And I'm going to hide behind the most excellent fellow, who speaks so eloquently on this, Senator Alan Simpson from Wyoming, who has spoken so brilliantly about the selfishness of many, not all, but many American Association for the Advancement of Retired Persons group. He is just extraordinary in matters of fiscal management of the government. What are we doing to the next generation? As he says, he's a stalking horse for the future and for his grandchildren. And so I worry that gerontocracy kicks in weird ways, and gerontocrats, of which I am now getting more qualified, just have to be kept a watch on to make sure they don't go small and selfish, and remember what education and public universities meant to them. And so it seems to me that what you have in your leadership here is just the most excellent gerontocrat redemption mission, that President Boren is a one-person gerontocrat redemption mission. And so, well, okay, so that was a very scattered set of remarks, but it kind of came to go Buffs at the end there for Ralphie.
I don't think we should ask Patty what she thinks about Sooners.
I will answer that because I feel
All
fine.
right. No, next question.
I have no problem with that because I see before me, how many Sooners am I looking at right now? Clap, wave your hands or something like that. Right. These are lovely people, and you can call them whatever you want, but they are lovely people, and somehow or other that word rallies them to a great cause of education. So I don't care. They're, heaven's sake, it's a fine word. And there's a little bit of a complication of history. Okay, where are you going to go where you're not going to have a complication of history, huh? So, okay.
Boomer Sooner. Well, let me ask you all a question that I hope isn't too self-indulgent as an Oklahoman, but when you think of the West is a big thing. It covers centuries and thousands of miles. It's not a singular phenomenon. And regional histories in the West are an important part of that story, and they're all different. So as six of the most distinguished scholars of the West sitting in one place, let me ask you, and I'll start with maybe Professor Taylor, we haven't heard from yet. What do you think of when you think of Oklahoma? How does our piece of Western history fit into the big arc of Western history? And you're allowed to be flattering.
So you're asking me, the one person on this panel who's written nothing about Oklahoma.
That's a good point.
Well, I'll just do a plug for my talk later in which I will explain why Oklahoma ends up at the very center of the United States.
Tim Egan, you have thoughts about Oklahoma? You certainly shared some remarkable thoughts with us today, but how would you pitch that in the bigger picture of Western history?
You know, I'm going to dodge that for 1 second because I just want to make one quick point about the universities and the foundings since I'm among these amazing time travelers. And by the way, thank you for letting me, a lowly bachelor's degree guy, among these scholars and geniuses here, professors all. My home state of Washington, the school I went to, the University of Washington, where Richard taught, there was a choice to be made during the territorial days. There were really two sort of decent settlements. One was called Walla Walla. You may have heard of Walla Walla, eastern Washington state, now known for its wines. The other was this godforsaken logging town on Puget Sound, full of misfits, whores, bigamists. Who have I left out? It was the most unchurched city, they said, still is in the United States. And they gave these two small communities a choice. They could have the university or they could have the penitentiary. And it was a fairly big debate. The penitentiary would guarantee a federal payroll. So they're going to send, regular money out. They're going to hold, it was a job creator. And Seattle chose the university. And destiny's been written large ever since. Walla Walla has the penitentiary still. And good wine, like I said, there's decent wine that now comes out of there. So it's, the biggest single job creator still in the largest job creating city in the United States right now, which is Seattle, is the university. So that, I wanted to just put that in its historical perspective when you have one of these choices to make. Now, to Oklahoma, I love the state's history because I just think it's everything that courses through the United States in so many amazing stories. I touched on the environmental one this morning. There's the immigrant story that comes to its highs and lows. There's a slavery story, the Tulsa riots, which are largely overlooked. There's this is the Indian dumping ground. What's the original name for Oklahoma? Doesn't it mean red people? Oklahoma, wasn't that the name? Come on, help me out, Oklahomans. Yeah, so I'm fascinated by this history. I was here a couple weeks ago doing a somewhat snide remark about the state legislature, a column. I was just appalled at this guy who wanted to ban the history he didn't like, which was I had some problems with the AP history class, like I said in my talk today, but you have a great history here, and Richard touched on how these. I loved your analogy of the transmission and throwing. My garage is just full of all those nuts. I don't know what to do with them. That's my writing room. So don't be afraid of it. It's fabulous. There's so many narratives. A long time ago, there was a writer. He got a Pulitzer Prize doing a book on busing in Boston. Now help me out with this. Yes, Anthony Lucas. And he was in Idaho working on a book about the labor movement then when the Buffalo Soldiers were called to put down the labor riots. That's what they used those Buffalo Soldiers were. They also figured in my book on the fire. They basically did all the cleanup work that no one else would do. So there's this huge, class conflict going on in Idaho. Just you talk about class conflict. I mean, they're bombing mines and hundreds of people are dying. And Lucas is working on this story. A governor is assassinated. And he calls me up and he says, my God, I'm from Boston. He goes, but there are so many great stories here in the West. I said, duh. I said, this is just a tabula rasa. There's just fantastic stories to be told. So I would just say, if you can keep the politicians out of the history making,
And the thing I would add is Oklahoma is a puzzle, depending, I don't mean that some metaphoric, it's a puzzle, man, but rather that situating it and how you think about history is a puzzle, and it really depends on when you're teaching it. So, okay, this is when we show of hands. How many of you took a history class in college? Which is usually, and if you took, this is great, I'm not surprised. A U.S. history survey is often taught in this 2-semester sequence divided at either 1865 or sometimes 1877, but in the 1860s, which is after my time, historically, in terms of what I study. So I don't care about it if it's after then. Now, in the second half of the survey, Oklahoma works. You can put Oklahoma in a class, not just because it is bounded within the territorial claims of the United States, but all of the issues that you want to talk about, not just in Western history, but in American history. Settlement, migration, opportunity, agriculture, politics, it works. You can find a way to put Oklahoma in there, not just in terms of the main currents of Western history, which a number of us have talked about today, but it also really works well with the kind of major currents in American history. Now, for the first half of the survey, Oklahoma is a challenge. Because do you talk about Oklahoma in a U.S. history survey class when you're talking about the 18th century? When I do my survey, I manage to find a way. I'd like to claim, I build my whole class around Oklahoma. I don't do that. And maybe Alan's talk today. Well, I'm telling you, after tonight,
That, Peter.
I'm doing the survey in the fall. I'm going to be ready to go. But I really want to emphasize that as a point here, that when we think about Oklahoma in the West, it really works in a lot of ways for that 19th and 20th century history, the sort of puzzle I would toss out to all of you as people who live in Oklahoma, and as you're getting ready for Alan's talk, when you think about the long history of your state, not just where do you situate it in the history of the West, but where do you situate it in its own history? Where do you think about it in terms of having a Mexican history, in terms of having an era where there's Spanish imperial claims, and of course, when there are Indian claims, but not the Indians who live here now. And that's what I mean when I say it's a puzzle, because we construct these histories, as Richard was very much explaining, around a series of narratives and stories that we want to tell. And, shall we say, early Oklahoma history is one of several places where that's really tough to do. And it's challenging in an exciting way, but it doesn't work in the way my home state of Pennsylvania works. That's a much easier, simpler story to tell. It makes it a little more boring as a result.
Well, I would say that the humid lands your relationship to the 100th meridian makes a little bit of a puzzle for me, because I am oriented towards issues of aridity, but I suspend that for the Pacific coast, much of the North Pacific coast, so it's not that big a thing. But if you were differently positioned with the 100th meridian, this would be an easier thing for me to say, absolutely central. But where I really hope to have more of a conversation is on the natural resource issues, especially oil and gas. Colorado has had a long history of that. The Rockies have had that, but it's so much more instructive and so much more interesting in this state. So I'm hoping I will be able to become better educated on that. I think that it was puzzling to me when Walter Echo Hawk, one of the most accomplished Indian advocates of the Native American Rights Fund, Pawnee Indian person, lived in Boulder, Colorado for years. Boulder, Colorado is a very nice place to live. When Walter Echo Hawk, after his very distinguished career of litigating on behalf of Indian people and their rights, when the first thing he did when he retired was move back to Oklahoma. And I thought, but you had Boulder. Which I did not say to Walter, and so anybody who knows Walter, and there probably are a few people, you can say that. I just thought, at first I thought, why do you want to do that? But I heard enough to know that this is so much where Walter Echohawk wanted to be. Most of what he had done at the Native American Rights Fund was originating out of his feelings for and ties for this state and its history. So that was instructive. And then I had the extremely good fortune to be assigned to write an essay on N.G. DeBow. Or N.G. Debo, I guess you're supposed to say. So, and that was a wonderful experience. And our friend Glenna Matthews made a movie about her. The scene where Angie is taken to the state capitol she's in a wheelchair. They're mounting the portrait of her on the walls at the Capitol, and they're putting the portrait up. She's in her 90s, she's frail, she's in a wheelchair. She looks up at where her portrait is, and she says, "Oh, they put me between two of the biggest thieves in this state's history." So that's when I want an honorary ceremony of adoption into Oklahoma identity, because I just think, oh, what a wonderful association to have with that remarkable person.
Well, this morning and this afternoon, Texas has taken some real hits, including for me. I'm a fifth-generation Texan. And one result of growing up that way is that by the time I left undergraduate school at the University of Texas at Austin, I was so sick of Texas history that the very mention of the Alamo made me physically ill. So consequently, I then went to Colorado and went into the field of Western history, but it was years before I could generate any interest whatsoever in the history of Texas. But one of the effects of that was to redirect my interest elsewhere in the West, and it became very quickly apparent that the history of Oklahoma is truly extraordinary, truly extraordinary. This place that was sort of the geographical other when I was growing up. My granddad, Dirt West, lived in Cisco, Texas. My grandmother would tell the story of when there were these northers would blow in, and he'd be out emptying the trash in his undershirt, because to wear a shirt was to admit that Texas climate could be unpleasant. And he would come back in with his sort of hair full of sleet and his face, blue, and he'd say, "Mame, I bet it's cold in Oklahoma." So that was, if you grow up in Texas with those sorts of roots, so that's all you think about. That's the image that you have of Oklahoma. But as Peter said, it's a fascinating place because it's a transition. It's a transition geographically. Patty talked about the 100th meridian going down right through the center of the state, and if you look, the green and the brown of the state, that becomes apparent. It's a transitional place also in terms of narratives. Whether you're looking at the Civil War narrative or whether you're talking at Clarence King's narrative, Oklahoma really is both of those. It's where they come together. It's a history that is brutal and has so much of the ugly side of the history of the West that Richard reminds us that we need to pay attention to. And you see it in the narrative where the Civil War and the West combine. The history of the Civil War in Oklahoma is a very ugly story that's very rarely told, but it's an important story. It's a story of the conflict that goes far beyond Indian and white. It goes into Indians against Indians in Oklahoma. It's a very complicated, very, very messy story. And I really can't think of any other Western state that captures so much, that brings together so many of these narratives and so many of these themes and insights as the history of cold Oklahoma.
Thank you for those answers, and it sort of leads me into my next question, which is about Native peoples. And a number of the talks today have mentioned or in some way included some consideration of Native cultures. But if you're asked to sort of put that in the foreground and think about not just Native cultures as something that lost, but in a more constructive sense, what's been the role of Native peoples in the making of the American West? Maybe another way to put it would be to ask how the American experience would have been different, or how has it been made unique by the relation between settlers and indigenous peoples. And I might start with Professor White, if you don't mind.
Well, I spend a lot of my time, not a lot, but I spend a significant amount of my time working with tribes, and most of them go back to treaty cases, which is the one point where the 19th century and even the late 18th century is still very much alive, because those documents are still the law. And to understand what those treaties mean involves going back to how people understood the world at the time the treaties were signed. And I think one of the things that surprised me, and one of the great ironies of American history, is that these treaties have become incredibly powerful documents. They were documents meant to dispossess, but by the United States did something very unusual by acknowledging, in fact, that Indian peoples had rights, and those rights had to be eliminated either by conquest or by negotiation. And then when the courts come in to rule that anything that is not specifically ceded in a treaty remains in effect, Indians obtained a huge leverage. And that leverage begins to be exerted really after the New Deal, during the New Deal, and more than that afterwards. So today, throughout the West, it is very hard to think about public problems around water, around energy, around gambling, around state revenues, even around elections, because there aren't many Indians who vote, but there's a lot of Indian tribes who have enough money to really begin to pump it into elections, particularly in a state like Washington. Indian tribes have become major players. I became involved as a historian because I was active in Indian fishing rights disputes in Washington. And one of the most astonishing things that I've ever seen as a historian, a very hopeful thing, is that Indian peoples are far more powerful today, and usually they're far more knowledgeable about the power that treaties give them than whites are in American society than ever before. A lot of the states I've lived in, if you're going to have a public policy that it remotely affects Indians, you better consult Indians. And that didn't used to be true. And their power, in an odd way, comes from the history. Their power comes from the treaties, because it certainly doesn't come from numbers. It certainly doesn't come from wealth. And so Indians, even more than Southerners, have managed to leverage defeat into a kind of identity that gives them a real power in the world. And I think that's, that history is the most alive part of 19th century history than anything I've seen, because every time I have to research it, what I find is going to have a result almost immediately in the world.
Yeah, that's about 5 great points there. I wrote this book about Edward Curtis, the photographer of North American Indians, and his magnum opus was The North American Indian, which is still, I think, the greatest photographic achievement in our history. Set out to document photographically all the people, quote, still living by the old ways, and ended up consuming him his whole life. The interesting point was at the start of the 20th century, the census count of how many Native people there were in the United States had about 250,000 total, and representing a diminishment of about 99%. So the narrative at the start of the 20th century, and this is what fueled Curtis, and this is why he was always in a hurry, was that they'd be gone. 10, 20 years. They were down to 250,000 total Native people in the United States living out of sight, living at the bottom of the Grand Canyon where the Havasupai are, living in the Washington rainforest where the Makah are, living where the Blackfeet are up in the high plains in northern Montana. They were out of sight and thought to be ready to be gone. Time and again, you'd read these things saying another 20 years there won't be an Indian left in the United States. So also the other interesting thing I learned in that research was that we revere the First Amendment in this country, which gives us free worship, free speech, unless you're an Indian. They outlawed so many Indian religious practices. This is what my guy Curtis was photographing, were these outlaw religious rituals, not taking a peyote, which he photographed that later on, but numerous rituals that they had performed for centuries were federal crimes, clearly violating the First Amendment right to free worship. Now, fast forward to what Richard just said. To go from that census at the start of the 20th century with 250,000 total Native people, a diminishment of 99%, to where they are now, which I saw the last census count had them at 2.5 million people who have majority Indian blood in them, is a great story of survival. And so the narrative becomes one of, I mean, Curtis contributed to this. They all sepia-toned people in the background, you know, there's no such thing as a modern Indian, or are they casino-owning modern power brokers? The story is largely positive to go from that diminishment at the start of the 20th century, what Richard said now. And he's so right on that history is what powers him. Those documents signed by presidents, those are treaties signed by presidents, nation to nation, in some cases small nations, especially in California and the Northwest. These are tiny little tribes living at the mouths of rivers. That's what allowed them to have a renaissance.
And one thing I should add is that, I mean, you were right in your observation that many of these talks were mostly talking about Indians as kind of objects rather than subjects. I know I did that because I was very much interested in talking about the federal leadership, but a starting point was your talk earlier lunch today when you were talking, you made a number of references to immigrants, particularly to the Irish. And in thinking about Western history without situating Indians at the center would be like Irish about the Irish. If you made the Irish history about the English who arrived there, that would be a similar equivalent. Now you could say that in many ways about all U.S. history, but it seems somehow particularly potent for thinking about Western history. And with using that as a point of comparison, it kind of gives us a sense not only of how one might tell the history, but also the problems, the reason also why it would be such an attractive history to Americans for so long to think of a West that was open and vacant, and then if there was an encounter with Indians, they were sources of violence and disruption. So that's why I often emphasize it to students who I'm teaching in this class, which, they'll say, why are you bringing up Indians again? This is in Missouri. This was the capital of Native America 1,000 years ago. And, they would say, why are you bringing this, why is this such an important part of this class? And I use those examples of, it would be like asking to talk about, I've not yet said it would be like talking about Ireland without talking about the Irish, but now I need to use that in the survey the next time they raise that.
The British did for 800 years, so.
So thank you for inspiring me to do that.
I was really fortunate to have an office just down the hall from Vine Deloria Jr., one of the leading, if not the leading, American Indian intellectuals, and also one of the funniest people on the planet. And so I would like to say a word on humor with Indian people, because that solemn, vanishing or about to vanish image has really been a problem, and the humor so corrects that. And I know Will Wilson's photographs with Curtis. Okay, so there's this guy, he's a Navajo photographer, and his sense of history is very strong, and his humor is very strong. So he learned everything he could learn about Edward Curtis's photographic techniques, and he uses them exactly. The only thing he does that's different is he uses a flash, and you don't have to sit still for 4 or 5 minutes or whatever you had to do with the Curtis thing. He uses wet plate photography. He does everything that Curtis does. So here's an Indian person who has gone further into Edward Curtis's mind than anyone except Tim Egan, who wrote the book and lived. That must have been weird, living with Curtis in your mind all that time. That must have been weird. But anyway, so Will Wilson takes these photographs. He takes photographs of contemporary Indian people and then develops them in the Curtis fashion. So a woman who's a banker, a native person who's a banker in Denver will look Curtis-like when he takes the photograph. She'll look, that skin darkens and she looks very ancient. And then he expanded and started taking photographs of non-Indian people who have some kind of alliance or ties with India. So I have a photograph of myself in the Curtis method. As Will is developing the photograph, I say, boy, my skin is looking very dark. He says, yes, I'm indigenizing North America 1% at a time. So I would go on, but I just think it's those moments of humor where the vitality, not to take a thing away from the tragedy and the sober and solemn parts of this story, but that resilient humor is just such an excellent feature in every photograph that Will Wilson takes, and every time that Vine Deloria made mocking fun of me. It was just a great moment, and something we're hoping to, actually at the Center of the American West, we're hoping to have a Vine Deloria humor initiative that really takes that tradition and makes fun of other people besides me.
Thank you all. I could selfishly ask this panel of 6 questions all day, but I'd like to open it up. I believe the students have the microphones again, so if members of the audience have a question, for one or more of our panelists, please raise your hand and they'll bring you a microphone.
And so if we could take this esteemed panel, pick them up, and regrettably drop them in the middle of the House floor, what would you advise them on the concept of American exceptionalism and teaching a happier, whiter history in Oklahoma?
I've not everyone heard every word of it, but if we could be plunked down in the legislature, and Peter's not going.
Like
Peter
screaming.
Yeah, Peter has another engagement and won't be able to join us. But I think I have had some successes when I can point out how one of the best ways to dehumanize a person is to make them boring. And the form of history that some of these folks, I don't want to use that, some folks would like, is actually a very terrible way of making their own ancestors boring. And that is no service to them. So that, in fact, the worst thing that can happen with young people and history is the yawn. And it is hair trigger, and they are ready to go with that yawn. And what was great in my state, in Jefferson County, just to the south of Boulder County, in my state, the school board, 3 members of a 5-member school board did something very similar, I guess, to what the some of the folks in Oklahoma are doing. And that got the students interested in history in the biggest way. It was great. They were out with signs, they were stopping cars, they were raising petitions. I thought, I've never had that impact on students. The 3 members of that school board got them all geared up about history. So, okay, so that's not, but I just think there's something about getting people to catch on that the worst thing that can happen is that yawn. And in ways that they may or may not have ever had the chance to notice, they have a yawn initiative going. And there's other moral complexities and there's other things, but the yawn is our greatest enemy, and they are inadvertently supporting that enemy.
Any others?
This whole business about exceptionalism puzzles me, as a lot of these debates about education do, and about scholarship. Like the word revisionism. Remember that? The people would get very angry at you. Are you a revisionist? And I'd say, well, I hope. Revision simply means to look again, to revision, to look, to relook and to re-examine something. That's what historians are supposed to do. Are we an exceptional nation? Of course we are. Every nation is different from every other nation. Everyone is exceptional in that sense. What they really mean is, should we teach American history in a way that is, if not absolutely uniformly positive, at least emphasizes the positive over everything else, and to avoid those parts of American history that are troublesome? I think that's preposterous. If you're doing that, you're not a history teacher. And I couldn't possibly answer that better, any better than Richard did at the close to the end of his remarks. Why in the world would you want to do that? Why would you actively set out to misunderstand yourself as an individual or as a culture or as a people? I don't get it, frankly.
Go ahead.
I mean, very few professional historians, virtually none, believe in American exceptionalism in its sort of classic form, which is that this nation is different from all other nations at any other time. I mean, even when you phrase it, it sounds like Passover. And I think what it is essentially a religious statement. And so it's very hard to argue with, because really people who believe in American exceptionalism, and it comes up in political campaigns more than any other time, is why it is we are a chosen people. Historians don't deal in chosen peoples. There are plenty of chosen peoples in the world. So when we go to debate this, it becomes a strange kind of debate. We're used to the kinds of things we would do in a department meeting or a classroom. It's, okay, tell me why Americans are different from all other peoples, and I will show you, in fact, they're not that different. But that's not a very useful form of argument, because it's essentially what they're giving you is a matter of faith. They're saying Americans are different from all peoples, and I know it, and if you don't believe it, you're not an American. And that's the kind of argument that goes nowhere. So what we do, I think, is relatively ineffectual. We have to do it, but what we make the argument is no. And we will go back to our discipline, because that's our main tool, to show you all the ways that the evolution of the United States is mostly like other nations. There are ways we're different, but there are ways everybody else is different too. But it doesn't really get to the heart of the matter, because the heart of the matter is, I taught in Utah a long time, and they actually got it right. They said history should be faith promoting. And when the ultimate aim of the history is to promote the faith, then historians don't have much to say, because it's really true. We're not very faith promoting, which isn't to say that we're not very deeply interested in this country, because at least for me, how in the world can you spend your adult life thinking and writing about a country that you don't like and aren't deeply interested in? I mean, it's a waste of time, but I don't come out in the same place. So it is a real problem. If you're plunked down on that floor, I think we would largely be talking past each other.
You know, does it diminish those people who came to Western Oklahoma and got a piece of land for the first time in their life to tell them that, in fact, Russia had a Homestead Act before we did, that Catherine the Great was giving away land to these exiled Germans who were largely pacifists? Of course not. It just makes it more interesting. So do I have to teach that we have the very first Homestead Act and no one ever did this before? No. Now, the one part of your question I don't think has gone addressed yet is, what would you specifically tell those legislators? And thank you for teeing that up nicely. It's a variant of what Richard said. The reason we have a First Amendment in part is because you don't want a state-run version of things. You don't want a state-run religion like the Anglican Church was the state religion of Britain. Why should the state be in the business of dictating history? I mean, these are supposed to be largely conservative people who want a state-run version of history. That's where the state itself is dictating. We are a diversity of voices, and from those voices comes the market of the, not even the consensus, but just this cacophony produces knowledge and wisdom. So the idea that someone's going to dictate a line that has to be written in, that you can't pass a history test unless you believe in this philosophy, which me, a politician, is dictating to you, goes against our history. It's ahistorical in and of itself. The one thing I'll say about that I was really encouraged by was a lot of the pushback here in Oklahoma came from students. Seniors say, wait, you're going to take away the AP class? That's free college credits. How crazy are you? You want to hurt the students of Oklahoma by taking away these AP classes, which save them money? And B, I found this wonderful piece written, I quoted it in my New York Times piece, by Oklahoma's Teacher of the Year of American History. And he said, of course I'm not going to teach American history without talking about internment. Of course I'm not going to teach American history without talking about how slavery got to be white supremacy. But there's the good with the bad. He just laid it out in a very simple way. What I would do now that I think about it, I would have those state legislators listen to the Oklahoma History Teacher of the Year. So.
Question about Oklahoma. I understand at one time Oklahoma was Indian territory. Is that right? Can you hear me? That Oklahoma was Indian territory. And then one day we had the Oklahoma Run. How was that rationalized? Did they pay the Indians for the territory, or did they take it, or a little of both? What was the mechanics of that happening?
I've actually just been writing about parts of this, see if I can remember it all. It was very complicated. It did not happen in a single day. What they started to do is chip away at a set of treaty guarantees, because basically what you had is Oklahoma territory, Indian territory in the west. They're totally different sets of Indians. One, the so-called 5 civilized tribes. Others, Indians relocated in the plains. And there's also a whole, I mean, you don't want to know all this detail. There's a Cherokee outlet. So each one has its own kind of separate story. But essentially what they do in the central part of the story is put a great deal of pressure on the 5 civilized tribes to give up their tribal governments. And they will do this under the threat of the Dawes Act, because essentially what's happening here is there's 2 Dawes Acts. There's the one that redistributes land on Indian reservations, but Dawes is also head of the Dawes Commission, which ends up wiping out the government. So the argument, I think, to go to the core of your question about how they rationalize, it's some of the most astonishing documents I've seen. I quote them in class, and they come. Oh, okay. Let's look at the Cherokee Nation. They said, well, you know, most of them are educated. As a matter of fact, the standard of living here is pretty much what we'd expect to find in a rural area of the United States. They have a government which has now been going on for 40 or 50 years and has to be pretty successful. But they said they've gone as far as they can go. And why have they gone as far as they can go? Because they don't have private property. They still own the land in common. So the argument becomes, for their own good, what we have to do is move in, dissolve their government, give them lands in fee simple, and then they can begin to progress even further than where they are before. So Americans rarely rationalize Indian policy by anything except beneficence, that this is, we're doing it for them. And this becomes part of the argument. As to redistributing the land, a lot of interesting things have happened in Oklahoma. As a matter of fact, it's been one of the most experimental parts of the whole United States. But there's a lot of competition for this, but probably the single stupidest idea I've ever heard in American history is when you have gotten land cessions from Indians and you're going to redistribute it to whites, you hold a race. Hadn't anybody heard of a lottery? I mean, what were they thinking? And you get a race where, in fact, there's all kinds of cheating and other kinds of land fraud which occupies the courts for years. So there's a complicated story to how this comes about. And I've given you basically the 5 civilized tribes story and the land rush story. But if you go out to the Panhandle and the others, there's cattlemen involved. You have this alliance between cattlemen and Indians to try to stave things off because the cattlemen have grazing rights. It ends up being a really complicated story, and there is no single moment where Oklahoma is Indian and the next moment it's white. It takes place over a period of about 15 years.
Thank you. I think we have time for one last question. I see a hand here in the middle. No pressure. Make it a good one.
Thank you. This has been wonderful. We've talked a lot about the past. I'm curious, how can we better teach a love for and the wisdom of the past using the technology of the future?
Great question. How can we use technology in the study and teaching of history? Any one of you could start handling that.
I'll give a very brief answer because it's something actually I've thought a lot about. And one of the things, it's a very bad example because visualization that didn't work, it does, when it does work. What we've had is this project which is spatial history, but it's a lot of ways you do it. Essentially, it's using computer history. And what we end up doing is bringing in students to ask big questions about railroads, about things where you have to enter a lot of data, and you're able to visualize instantaneously once you have the data in a kind of pattern about how things develop. And as a teaching tool, it has been absolutely extraordinary. And it's been extraordinary for a couple of reasons. First of all, the students coming in have computer skills that the faculty doesn't have. So first of all, they realize not only are they on a level with us, but they're even with us. And the second thing they realize is we don't know the answer. And what I explained to them is the reason I'm asking this question is I don't know the answer. Why would I ask this question if I knew the answer? And at that point, they realize that what history is using these tools, a way to first get better questions and then get answers to those questions. So in these kinds of projects, what I found is the students pretty much take over. Without even knowing it, They're becoming historians, they're posing the questions, they're figuring out how to answer them, and they're using data in ways that historians haven't used before because we've never been able to use these kind of tools to bring it in. But what they're doing is the kinds of things all historians do. You got to go in the archives, you have to be critical of documents. If you don't ask good questions, you're not getting good answers, and they're learning all of those things.
And there's several, I want to talk about, I want to add a few comments there also about how the current technologies do not help. So what Richard's talking about is absolutely true. That one of the things that current technologies have enabled students to do is to ask really sophisticated questions, the kinds of questions that even academic historians could not ask because they simply didn't have the means to both analyze and visualize this large amount of material. But the first way that some of the newer technologies have entered the instruction of history is the arrival of the computer in the classroom, by which I mean an individual student with an individual computer taking notes on that computer. And as somebody who actually very much likes working in humanities computing, I prohibit laptops in my lectures for the simple reason that it's like dangling candy in front of, well, I was going to say a baby, it's like dangling candy in front of me and saying not eat it, which is that it requires a student to both resist the temptation, the incredible temptation of distraction, and to do something else. I'm reminded of someone who told me that this was in a law school class where students often have laptop computers. Someone told me there was a classmate who spent the whole semester playing Tetris. It's a computer game. And as she then added, and he didn't get any better. So he clearly learned nothing from the class. So oddly enough, this device that many students have, the laptop computer, is as a classroom tool often as much an impediment as an opportunity, in that it can be an incredible distraction, and students often transcribe rather than synthesize, which is what they had to do when they were, and still have to do when they take notes by hand. But that's very different from one of the things that most surveys and analysis of student learning is showing, is that these technologies are incredibly helpful when they are designed to be used as such. And one example is exactly what Richard was talking about, which is the ways that you can analyze large amounts of information to see patterns and understand things that you simply couldn't understand before. Another example, which is in some ways a more crude use of the technology, but is just as powerful, is the way that digital technologies have given people access to primary sources in a way that they never had before. And so one of the first digital items I assign in a course I teach is a letter. It is a handwritten letter from the 1830s. And in some ways this seems so simple, but it is electric. It's powerful for the students who are looking at it. They see, oh, this is something that somebody actually wrote. Very recently, those primary source documents were incredibly undemocratic because access to them was limited to people who had the time and the institutional resources to get to a collection and look at them, which basically meant academic historians. So access both to the individual primary source, which has been incredibly democratized over the last 20 years, and access to the kind of analyzable aggregate data that Richard's talking about in a way that can be visualized, which is a more recent development, is the other piece of this. And I see those as the best ways that these technologies of the future, or of the present as you've called them, help our understanding of the past.
Go ahead. Yes. You all have a skill that my students don't have. You can read cursive handwriting. Students this year to the archive. It wasn't even that the writing was illegible. They no longer know how to read cursive, so we had to go through and be able to do that. They expected all documents to be typewritten.
I'm personally looking forward to the hologram that will bring Teddy Roosevelt onto this stage. I have a few more questions still to ask of him, despite the exhaustive his portrayal in the Ken Burns Roosevelt thing. The democratization of first-hand stuff is extraordinary. And I noticed in the last book I used to have to take 5 days, go to the library, have them nag me, tell me I'm not really an academic and I couldn't get access. It was only the elite could get at these things. And Stanford Library is the same way. Really hard to get at this stuff. They were locking out, Yeah, thank you. It was hard. But now it's just amazing. It's all there. It's not it's all, but so much of it's there. It's extraordinary. And that translates to a student level. So it's not authors, elites, et cetera. We're all interested in that, but students can go to that. Now, I want to add one more thing here. The most popular television show in public television history in the last 10 years is Downton Abbey. Now, this is a high soap period drama, late Edwardian. I'm as addicted to it as the next person. Lady Mary, that cold-hearted Tory bitch, what will she do next, I absolutely love that show, and I think the reason it works is not just the upstairs, downstairs, not the crazy who will be with whom. The textural details, the little bell that rings, how the soup, do you use a melon spoon versus a soup spoon? A major deal among the English, by the way. And his next project, you'll like this, Richard. Fellows, the guy who created Downton Abbey, is The Gilded Age. So he's going to do a long period drama for American public television on the Gilded Age. Now, this sort of goes to the technology question in that quality television, HBO, PBS, can do really terrific drama that gets the details right. And I think one of the things you get kids excited about in history is you say, put on a dress from the Victorian age. Tell me how hard it is to get that thing trusted around you. Wear those clothes. For that matter, for the history of the West, wear the same pair of underpants for 2 weeks. When you do these sort of textural details, it changes your view of that period. Sorry.
Well, I wasn't expecting that to be the last comment of the day. Join me in thanking them. Thank you.